Imagine you're the newly appointed professor of mental and moral philosophy at the University of Otago. The year's 1887. You're a Presbyterian minister. You've recently been recruited for the position by the Presbyterian Synod of Otago Southland. No doubt the dream job of many clergy today. But back then, the Reverend William Salmond found himself in hot water on two counts. First, the Synod had made the appointment without proper reference to the University Council. And second, you've only just put your toes under the desk when you face a heresy trial, the trial arranged by none other than your Synod. A decade or so before, in 1877, the Synod had decided to endow a chair of natural science. It had just appointed William Salmond as the new professor of theology at the Presbyterian Theological College. It was intimately connected with the university. Salmond was very much against the new theories of Charles Darwin, so it was no surprise when the favoured appointee to the science chair, F.W. Hutton, a convinced Darwinist, was blocked by the Synod. They didn't appreciate Hutton's theology, nor did they understand what he was on about as a scientist. University Council responded to the Synod's decision by funding the chair from its own resources and by appointing Hutton as the first incumbent. Hutton was an ardent supporter of Darwin's theory of evolution, but unlike Darwin, retained a strong belief in purpose in the universe, teleology. Darwin himself was an ardent supporter of Hutton. Significantly, in 1877, the New Zealand government legislated for the free, compulsory and secular education of primary school children. So it wasn't just university councils which wished to be free of undue church influence. There was a curious ambivalence on the part of the Presbyterians to science. On the one hand, they had a tradition of educated clergy and the legacy of the Scottish Enlightenment. On the other hand, they were caught up in a view of the Bible that had long since become untenable. Professor Salmond believed in the veracity of all the books of the Bible. The Christian scriptures had to be defended as the revealed Word of God, Calvinism. They were accurate and truthful books without exception. Now, Salmond was equally, if not more, alarmed at the combined effects of the new higher criticism of the Bible and the theory of evolution taken together. So he went on the attack at a stormy meeting of the Otago Institute. Salmond clashed with Hutton. Heated opinions were expressed, and in the end a compromise was agreed to. A series of lectures was to be arranged for later that year. Some tempers were not cooled by the passage of time, however. Within a few months, Dr. Stewart, the University Chancellor, and a Presbyterian, of course, would resign from the Institute rather than be, quote, associated with atheists, unquote. But there's a significant twist in this story, and as in the case of the Reverend A.R. Fitchett, one of the chief protagonists was the Otago Daily Times. Salmond went to hear Hutton at those Institute lectures later in the year. He went in convinced of the truth of his own opinions, but came out an evolution of the Hutton kind, according to a newspaper report. The press congratulated Salmond, quote, on having made a gigantic stride toward Captain Hutton's side, unquote. Admittedly, the editor wasn't prepared to let Salmond off too lightly, so the newspaper reprimanded him for the extreme harshness of his previous views. Even the public apology it made was done too jauntily and with insufficiently apologetic tone. Interestingly, the ODT wasn't prepared to let the matter rest there. And a week later, it was raised again, noting that it was quite certain where the blame ought to be laid for the unchristian controversy which had divided Dunedin. It was at the feet of Professor William Salmond. After all, he'd been willing to undertake a public crusade for Presbyterian orthodoxy and a literal belief in the scriptures against Darwinism. So the olive branch offered to Salmond at the time of his conversion was thus wielded as a cane within a week. Over the course of the next 11 years, much happened in the professional lives of Fitchett, Salmond and Hutton. Slowly but surely, Salmond's Christian beliefs evolved. And in 1888, he faced a heresy trial in the Dunedin Presbytery. The charges related to a small pamphlet called The Reign of Grace. Salmond wrote that a strict adherence to the doctrine of predestination was no longer tenable. Instead of some being willed by God to everlasting salvation and the rest sent to everlasting damnation, double predestination, Salmond argued for the possibility that all might be saved. This, of course, was the Methodist theology of John Wesley. And, of course, A.R. Fitchett, even though he had joined the Anglicans. The Presbytery found Salmond guilty of publishing heretical notions. It was a decisive vote, 16-8. The Presbytery ordered the suppression of his booklet, an action which no doubt increased its sales. So Salmond himself implied in the foreword of the first reprint. It ran to 5 editions and sold several thousand copies. Before then, however, a majority of the clergy wished him out of Presbyterian ministry altogether. That was a step the Presbytery wasn't competent to take, but the synod was. Thus, the matter was duly brought before the higher ecclesiastical court. They found him guilty of heresy, but declined to take further action, having just appointed Salmond to the chair of mental and moral theology. Truth is stranger than fiction. Join me next week as we return to John Wesley's helpers, this time in the early 20th century. And thanks for watching.